Hello and welcome back to An English Major Explains. Today we're going to talk about, unfortunately, why Harry Potter is quite bad. And before I get to the roadmap, I want to introduce my little guest that we're going to have for recording today is this little friend. I love him. I got him after the show last week tonight. Put up a segment about Alexander Lukashenko, who is the authoritarian president of Belarus. And essentially, how do I explain this? There is quite a bit of lore involved in this sweet little friend who I have named Bear, and I would die for him. So I will put a link to the segment in a card in the video, just so that folks can go take a look at it. Money from adopting this sweet little guy goes to organizations that are helping the people of Belarus fight political persecution, political imprisonment, helping refugees resettle, things like that. There's, again, more information is going to be in the video because John Oliver goes into depth about the bear. But yeah, he's gonna be sitting right here off camera, taking a look and watching me do my thing. All right, so let's get into the roadmap. I'm also doing a couple of different things with my setup. I took the lamp that I usually use, which is my only light source, and I put it on top of a set of dresser drawers, and that is essentially what is lighting the rest of my room, because unfortunately, the lamp in my dorm room has not worked since I moved in, and I don't feel like emailing anybody to do anything about it. Alright, so here is the roadmap. It is quite short because everything that is involved in this video is super long. Okay, so roadmap. Overview of the Harry Potter book series. That's the first thing. The second thing is the overview of the Harry Potter movie series. I'm also going to be talking about casting for this movie as well. And then the fourth thing is going to be JK Rowling is a bigot, and here's why. And we're going to talk a lot about colonialism and the different facets of colonialism and the actual mechanisms by which colonialism comes to be normalized and stuff like that. And then the last thing, as always, wrap up and final thoughts. All right, so let's get into it. Overview of the Harry Potter book series. The Harry Potter series tells us the story of an orphan boy who learns he is a wizard and attends a magical school that will teach him to use his powers for good, in addition to the underlying plot against his life by the man who killed his parents and his intention to plunge the wizarding world into a Nazi-esque authoritarian regime. I know that there's a lot of other stuff involved in the plot, especially from book to book, but that's just a basic overview of the whole thing. The series follows Harry Potter, son of Lily and James Potter, and his two friends Ron Weasley and Hermione Granger through their adolescence and academic life at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. I'm not going to talk about the Cursed Child, or how JK Rowling made Harry a wizard cop, or how she appropriated indigenous culture and spiritual practices in a classic colonizer fashion, so we will just move on to the order of the books. A large chunk of analysis of JK Rowling's construction of the Harry Potter franchise is going to be done later in the video, so this is just broad strokes. The books were released as follows. Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone was released in 1997, The Chamber of Secrets was released in 1998, Prisoner of Azkaban in 1999, Goblet of Fire in 2000, Order of the Phoenix in 2003, Half-Blood Prince in 2005, and Deathly Hallows in 2007. Another novel of Rowling's that is included in the literary family of the Harry Potter novels is Harry Potter and the Cursed Child in 2016. I also know that Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, even though it was a movie-only kind of production, there are, I believe, bound scripts, actual hardback book of the writing that went into it. I'm not entirely sure, so I didn't include it. Let's see. Nope. Okay. So let's move on to the movies. The Harry Potter movie series replicates the books pretty closely on screen in terms of basic element plot structure, basic narratives, and things like that, and were released as follows. The first movie, The Philosopher's Stone, was released in 2001. Chamber of Secrets was released in 2002. Prisoner of Azkaban was released in 2004. Goblet of Fire in 2005. Order of the Phoenix in 2007. Half-Blood Prince in 2009, and then the last book was split into two movies. Deathly Hallows Part 1 was released in 2010, and then Deathly Hallows Part 2 was released in 2011. I don't get it with racist white women in the fantasy genre and releasing two-part finales to their movies. Like, say your piece and go. Don't make me pay $12 more for this. Anyway, casting. The main cast, basically the big three, is Daniel Radcliffe playing Harry Potter, Emma Watson as Hermione Granger, and then Rupert Grint as Ron Weasley. Some other important roles that I wanted to go over, just because they seem really important in the grand scheme of things. Tom Felton as Draco Malfoy, Alan Rickman as Professor Severus Snape, Dame Maggie Smith as Professor Minerva McGonagall, Richard Harris and Michael Gambon as Headmaster Albus Dumbledore. I say both these names because Richard Harris was the original person casted as Professor Dumbledore, but he passed away in 2002, and then they had to recast for the third movies onward. Ivana Lynch as Luna Lovegood. She doesn't come in until the later 2 or 3, maybe 4 movies, but I love her, so I'm mentioning her here anyway. And then last but not least, Ralph Fiennes as He Who Shall Not Be Named, Lord Voldemort. Something else that I found interesting here is that there are so many shifts and changes made to the production team according to the Wikipedia article. I'm not in particular really having an issue with that. It's just something that I found interesting. Directing, movies 1 and 2 were directed by a man named Chris Columbus, which, Movie 3 was directed by Alfonso Cuarón. Movie 4 was directed by Mike Newell. And then movies 5 through 8 were all directed by David Yates. And then in regards to screenwriting, movies 1 through 4 were written by Steve Kloves. Movie 5 was written by Michael Goldenberg. And then movies 6 through 8 were again written by Steve Kloves. I don't know what the deal with this is, but I haven't seen anything regarding some form of meddling on JK Rowling's part, so I'm just gonna chalk it up to creative decisions on behalf of the studio. However, the thing that I am positive is absolutely the result of meddling on Rowling's part is the issue of casting for Lavender Brown. Lavender Brown was a minor character in both the book and the movies, and as the movies grew in notoriety, they recast her twice, which means she was played by 3 different people. However, the character of Lavender Brown was originally played by British actress Kathleen Colley, who was originally uncredited in movie 2. Movie 3, she was played by Jennifer Smith, and then beginning in movie 6, she was played by Jessie Cave. Going from actress to actress, Lavender Brown got progressively more lines and had an emphasized presence in the narrative. What really bothers me, though, is that it seems that this classic issue of a person of color being the perfect body to fill a role when there's no importance placed on their character, and then once their character becomes important in the narrative or gets more screen time, they immediately recast them as a white person or a white passing person. And that, to me, screams the only person that's acceptable to put in front of a camera is a person that can be read or accepted as white. And I will get to why this is Joanne's doing in a minute. And that brings me to... This is the section that I am calling Harry Potter and the Bigoted Author, mainly because JK Rowling is a full-blown bigot. Here's why. When it comes to the reading of how she's constructed these characters and the relationships that they have, both in the books and the movies, it is palpable that it is a consequence of just the socio-political culture of Britain being heavily entrenched in imperialism and colonialism. Birthplace of colonialism, Britain touts itself as an enlightened, post-racist, post-homophobic, post-transphobic, post-gun violence society, despite the fact the overarching identity of whiteness in Britain literally invented all of these things and then unleashed them on my ancestors in a vain attempt at conquering the world. You remember learning the phrase, "the sun never sets on the British Empire"? Think about that for a minute, and consider the fact that they are still really going hard at that. Britain as a concept is just personally offensive to me as an Afro-Indigenous person. That has nothing to do with media criticism. I just needed to say that. Specifically, I want to talk about how characters that are either stated or coded as Indian, Irish, Scottish, or East Asian are deliberately portrayed as some stereotypical figures by no sleight of hand. It's fully intentional. Let's look at how British colonialism is to blame for this annoyance. I'm going to dive a little deeper into some defining characteristics of colonialism, like I did in my Loki video, which I'll link in a card right there, just for the sake of further defining Rowling's personal bigotry and how it translates from her personal views to the text. A strong pillar of colonialism, and to a degree imperialism, is the destruction of the victim's mother tongue. It is a documented process that the act of colonization involves the imposition of the colonizer's language and cultural trappings onto that of the colonized population. So in that regard, I want to look into a specific kind of colonialism that is outlined in various studies of history, specifically national colonialism. National colonialism is a process in which nation building and colonization are symbolically entwined, and in which the colonial regime, in this case the British Crown, seeks to break down the structure of another culture in order to remake it as a part of its own. The goal, by definition, is to integrate them into the state, but only as reflections of the state's preferred expression of culture. If you're interested in learning more about this specific kind of colonialism, because I know that the differentiations between specific subcategories of colonialism is very nuanced, I'll refer you to a piece written by Ting Hong Wang in May of last year titled Education and National Colonialism in Post-War Taiwan, The Paradoxical Use of Private Schools to Extend State Power, 1944 through 1966. That's going to be in the description box, mainly because I want to throw back credit to the matter being referenced in Wikipedia. Anyways, a documented aspect of colonialism, specifically within national colonialism, is the imposition of a colonial language upon an indigenous language. So in this context, the imposition of English into Gaelic spaces and resources. Gaelic was outlawed by the British Crown in Ireland in 1616, and then had stronger restrictions placed upon its teaching and speaking in 1745. In Scotland, usage of Gaelic had already been documented as, quote, declining in the 1400s, so there isn't much I could find in regard to there being a law on the books in Scotland as I could find in Ireland. Now, allow me to elaborate on how the act of outlawing an entire language manifests, because that's how deep we're going today. When you outlaw a language, that essentially means that you cannot use texts in that language to teach in schools that are receiving some sort of aid or funding from the government to distribute political literature. You can't create systems of state documentation in that language. You can't train people to work. You can't distribute safety signs, etc., etc. Basically, the outlawing of Gaelic means nothing having to do with the state can have anything to do with the English language. They are mutually exclusive through that outlawing process. They cannot exist at the same time. This means people who have been speaking this language their whole lives suddenly become illiterate because they can't learn, they can't work, and they can't stay safe because resources for them to do those things are no longer available in their language. Ultimately, they can't live the way that they've been living their whole lives, which has been passed down to them culturally. They have to completely forget and drop the trappings of their own culture in order to function like a normal person in the society being controlled by the British Crown. The reason why I'm fixating so much on language here is because Western Apache, a dialect of Southern Athabascan, and Taino, which is a dialect of Arawak, are names. Nde and Taino literally just means people or people of the land. We are who we are because we had the language to define ourselves. But when the Spanish began colonizing the Americas, they decided that this wasn't good enough. We had to call ourselves the word that they had forced onto us, or we couldn't speak at all. Literally, the only reason indigenous people of the Americas are called Indians is because Columbus is as stubborn as the mules he fucked and didn't want to admit that he was nowhere near India when he actually saw land. Each tribe has our own names for who we are, but they are mostly just people. It was Spanish and British colonization that changed that. And when you take away that aspect of culture and being able to self-determine who you are to yourself, that is uniquely dehumanizing. And it just creates this idea that you are not good enough to tell yourself who you are. The colonizer's culture, the colonizers have to tell you who you are. That's why I fixate on language with this, I guess. Another arm of colonization is creating an unfavorable view of those being colonized by the ones doing the colonizing in order to strengthen their ability to do colonizing. And it doesn't even stop at, well, we took over Ireland and Scotland and we've effectively eradicated the devilish little pieces of their culture. Well done, chap. It persists. Anytime people push back against colonial culture, the colonial power bulldozes them and pushes negative stereotypes onto them into the lay public, mainly so that people who may be on the fence in terms of supporting colonizer versus supporting the colonized, or people who are, I don't want to say loyal to the colonial power, that's not a great way to phrase that, but people who are, I guess, like, complacent about the colonization that's taking place are less likely to support people pushing back against colonization, no matter how right they are. Case in point, when America laid siege to the Kingdom of Hawaii, people whose loyalties lied with the U.S. government and the Dole family began distributing racist caricatures of Queen Liliuokalani, depicted in the same way that white people would create caricatures of Black Americans, in order to disparage her, even though she wasn't Black. Literally, black skin, swollen lips, messy and curly hair, large teeth, exaggerated hips and breasts and feet, all because they wanted to farm sugar on land that didn't belong to them. They were taking this already racist stereotype that they had pushed onto Black Americans and were simply just putting it onto somebody else in order for people in America to be like, oh, well, of course, America needs to take that land. Look at the people who live there, It's like that. It's drawing on the attitudes that are already in place due to other modes of colonization, racism, systemic oppression, in order to make what the colonizer is doing okay. Imagine being such a racist piece of shit that you can't even come up with a new stereotype to attack somebody. It's just pure laziness. This directly led to the idea that supporting Hawaiian independence was supporting Black American sovereignty in the U.S., which was already a highly contentious position in the 1880s. Not only that, but Hawaiians were so discouraged from their fight by the way that they were portrayed that Queen Liliuokalani surrendered. She couldn't take that not only were they slandering her, but the people that she served, the people that she wanted to protect. That is literally colonialism in action. More on that in a minute. And then this attitude of the colonizer or the empire wanting to disarm the people that they have intent to colonize and take their power away from them. This is where they get stereotypes that Scottish families breed like rats and live in declining conditions because of it, or that Irish people are all pyromaniacs and all Indian people are snobby and stuck up toward white people specifically, and that Chinese women are very coquettish and submissive to white people. It's just fucking gross. It's just gross. Also, unrelated to absolutely anything, if you are watching this right now as a British person with Scottish, Irish, Welsh ancestry, I am asking you as a fellow reconnecting person to decolonize. Research your family's ancestry. Look into learning Gaelic or Welsh. Devote time to really understanding that a national identity is not really an ethnic identity. British is not an ethnic group. Also, it is my personal belief that I could decolonize Tom Hiddleston, specifically because he's already sort of leftist and disinterested by the crown. By British standards, that's a discussion for another time. But I could do it. Anyway, here is how all that English breakfast-flavored nonsense manifests in the Harry Potter books. Ron Weasley is one of 7 red-headed freckled children born to his parents, Molly and Arthur. Rowling says that Ron is based on one of her real-life friends, but given how deeply xenophobia in Britain focuses specifically on Scotland and Ireland, I don't buy it. The Weasleys live in a tiny rundown house in what seems like the middle of nowhere, barely making it on a shoestring budget from Arthur's job at the Ministry of Magic, and it truly doesn't read as coincidental to me that Ron as a character is so heavily defined by these British stereotypes that are assigned to Scottish people that he is not himself a stereotype, like a caricature of a person. Then we move on to Seamus Finnegan, an Irish-born wizard who has a penchant for pyromania and explosions. Gee, why would a British woman write a character who is explicitly Irish as a person who likes fire and explosives? Could it be because of the bombings that occurred during the Troubles from the late 1960s to 1998 that Britain began externalizing its racism and xenophobia to begin making light of this tragedy in order to make themselves look superior and make Irish people look like, quote, savages? That doesn't sound familiar at all.
Oh, by the way, I was being sarcastic.
Cho Chang is the only East Asian character in the entire series, and her name is Cho Chang. Moving on. There is this very weird obsession with being a pureblood or a half-blood wizard, which Malfoy says to, I believe, Hermione and several other kids. It calls them mudbloods. And when I came back into this series and this journey that I had of reconnecting and decolonizing, it just smacks of Blood Quantum's role in colonization and the eradication of indigenous people. It's a really big deal within the universe and this narrative takes place in. The first entry on the Harry Potter fandom wikia for Ron Weasley is that he is a 12th generation pureblood wizard, and on every character's little side panel is whether or not they too are pureblooded or not. And I get this is the foundational stone of why Voldemort is such a bad guy and why everybody who is aligned with him has this stance, but for it to have permeated so deeply into the environment of people who are not of Voldemort's alignment is, it's just weird. I don't like it. Oh yeah. Let's go on a tangent about house elves. The house elf that seems most important to Harry's narrative and Harry's story is named Dobby, and he's responsible for all the cleaning and dirty jobs that go on in houses like the Malfoys. This is something that an elf in this universe is born into. It is a social class for a specific group of people. There's no pathway to freedom for house elves unless their masters give them an article of clothing to wear. From what I've seen in the movies, these masters are usually pure-blooded, white magical families. And you know what's really, really funny is that this sounds an awful lot like Miss Rowling is boiling down one group under the Indian caste system, one which translated is called washerman, or remover of dirt, and whose place is considered beneath that of others, and then saying that if they would simply accept the gift as their white masters gave them, they would be free from the cycle of dehumanization and servitude. And you know what else is really funny about that? Is that it sounds an awful lot like Rudyard Kipling's The White Man's Burden, in which Kipling posited that if only the Filipino people would submit to the U.S. control of their lives, they would be free from all the problems that they were experiencing. Funny how those things sound related.
Oh, by the way, I was being sarcastic.
Another huge part of colonization, which I think a lot of people forget, that plays into why Rowling is such a racist, transphobic freak, is the really strict gender binary that was imposed upon cultures of places that Britain colonized. Prior to colonization, places like Indonesia, India, the Americas, Greenland, and more, the idea of a gender role and a gender binary, or gender expression within that binary, did not exist under the constraints that it did in Britain. For example, under the structure of whiteness in Britain, the gender binary is set up this way. There are two genders, man and woman. These are based off the fact that men have penises and women have vaginas. Men are workers, women are homemakers. Marriages consist of one man and one woman and the resulting offspring. Men wear pants, suits, have short cropped hair, and go to work and go to school in order to provide for their wife and children. Women wear dresses, have long hair, don't go to school, and take care of the home, and children only. And the reason why I bring that up is because I feel like more people should talk about this when it comes to things that have to do with colonization and imperialism, and deconstructing the overarching structure of whiteness and all of these things that are included in it, because, as I'm going to say right now, a lot of these things are sexist, they're capitalist, they're misogynist. It inherently excludes the idea that a person's gender can exist outside of the man with penis or woman with vagina dichotomy. It bars women from participating in what constitutes education and makes their domestic labor and knowledge worthless. It sets up the idea that marriage is not only defined by the number of people who partake in it, but also the kind of people who partake in it and what happens when they get married. It's also all arbitrary. It's literally meaningless. There is no real reason why people with penises are inherently deemed men, or why people with vaginas are inherently deemed women. In the basic elements of this binary, there is no inherent reason. It simply is. And you know what else it is? Stupid! When white Europeans began colonization, this was also a huge part of the process, because these assumptions on gender and sexuality were part of the social culture of their home countries and empires. And even though indigenous people in the Americas and Australia acknowledged gender identities and sexuality outside of these bounds, the process of overtaking these cultures meant imposing the strict gender binary and the sexuality therein Europe had in place already onto these people, even though there was no other reason to change their systems of gender and sexuality at all. The reason why I bring this up is because in The Goblet of Fire, a weirdly important plot point in the Triwizard Tournament is Harry retrieving this mechanical golden egg from the first task. And I say it's weird because the only way that Harry can open the egg without the damn thing screaming at him is to be underwater, because the next task is to retrieve something that has been taken from each of the champions and placed at the bottom of the lake at Hogwarts, right? So for some reason, Harry chooses to go to the girls' bathhouse. Why? There was literally no reason for him to have done it in the girls' bathhouse specifically, because then what JK Rowling is saying is that boys don't take baths, which is a pretty weird thing to say that you believe. But the reason why I think JK Rowling chose to devote so much unnecessary othering to this action, both in the movie and the book, because it is, this very weirdly important thing. There's a lot of stuff that is entailed in that. Why she chose to devote so much time to this is because of this obsession with gender policing that goes on within the gender binary set up by whiteness and colonialism, and to a degree imperialism. Anybody who engages with gender outside of this binary has to be put on blast and publicly shamed into oblivion in order to preserve the existence of the binary as an institution and as a way of life. Harry is an outcast from the beginning of this journey, but this is how we're made to see him as readers. As readers, we're meant to see him as a sympathetic way, we're meant to see him in a sympathetic way, as a person whose parents are murdered, who's forced to live in an abusive home, and who can only find 2 friends at a school of what seems like 1,000 kids. But in this moment, with him in the egg in the bathtub, it's not presented as sympathetic. It's presented as something creepy and unnatural, and that he is not supposed to be there. That's what we're meant to get from this, that he's doing something criminal by being there. Ultimately what I get from this, and what we all found out in the past couple of years, is that this system of othering, that when you are an other, you are inherently criminal, and everything you do has an air of criminality to it, and everybody needs to be watching you and needs to be correcting you at every single moment, because everything you do is either wrong or it's violating some sort of law, and this is one of the laws. Bad work, Joanne. Bad. Alright, so let's talk about where we've been. Let's climb out of this rabbit hole and find out. First, I went over the trappings of the book series and some very general details about the publishing of the books. Then I went over some details with the film releases. Then I went over some issues that have arisen from the casting process, specifically regarding the character of Lavender Brown. And then I decided to go into a deep dive on why it is that JK Rowling is a bigot, where her bigotry seems to stem from, how it manifests in the scope of the narrative, in the movies, in the books, and then how it positions us as the reader to see certain actions through certain lenses, because the lenses are pushed onto us by JK Rowling. Admittedly, there was way more discussion of colonialism and the structure of whiteness that I had intended to include when I first started doing this. But once I sat down to write the notes for this video, the hyperfixation took me, and I simply had to follow. Final thoughts. What are my final thoughts? I don't like JK Rowling as a person or an author. I think that we as a reader base need to invest our time in other series that simply do not have such intense bigotry baked into the foundation of their narratives. The stories are out there. We simply need to seek them out. We need to critically analyze why it is that the narrative that the universe holds is structured in such a way that it is, and if the foundation of that structure is bigoted, we really need to call attention to it. I know that for a lot of people, including myself, this is a huge part of their childhood, and for me, the character of Harry Potter was somebody I empathize with on a very personal level. And like me personally, it broke my heart when I got older and realized the kind of terrible ideas that JK Rowling was putting forward in this story, that held such deep meaning to me, the story, not the beliefs. But I'm an adult. I can say, hey, I appreciate this concept of Harry Potter. I appreciate the fact that as a person who grew up unloved and alone, he found his way to happiness and peace. I appreciate that despite the tragedy that befell him, he still put one foot in front of the other and kept walking. However, I can also say I don't appreciate that my identity as a trans person is positioned as inherently predatory or criminal. I don't appreciate that my identity as an Afro-Indigenous person is being used to prop up white characters. And if I were a character in this universe, I would have no agency. I would just be there to support, I don't know, Wizard McWizard Boy and the Saltine Gang. Do better, Joe! So I'm making the decision for all of us to do 3 things. The first one being have higher standards for what we're consuming, especially because we're adults. We can make that choice for ourselves. 2, we're gonna hold our literary idols to higher standards. 3, decolonize. Land back. That's it. Oh yeah, I'd eat my ass specifically, Miss Rowling. I would tell you to crawl back into the hole you came out of and leave us all alone, but sadly you have superglued your head in between your ass cheeks, so I don't think you'd be able to find your way back anyway. Oh well. Alright, so that is the end? Is that the end? Yes, it's the end. Yeah, that's the end for this video. My next one that I'd really like to do is about being an English major, for reasons that I'll get into when I make it. Yeah. And then to thank our special guest. His name is Bear, and I would die for him. Thank our special guest for being here. Thank you, special guest. And yeah, if you are interested in trying to undo some of the damage that's been done to the trans community, especially in Britain, or the United Kingdom at large, as it is unfortunately called, I would suggest that everybody go to the Mermaids UK Foundation website, find out ways that you may be able to donate or to spread literature around that helps protect trans kids, that also helps to dispel some of the hurtful rumors and myths that JK Rowling and her ilk have been passing around about trans people, especially with her new horrible garbage fire of a book. Yeah, do that. Yeah, that's it. I will see you next time. Bye.